The Germans famously invaded the Soviet Union under Operation Barbarossa, which many claim online was the reason why Germany was the Second World War. Due to the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a 10-year-long non-aggression pact, which Germany broke 2 years later. But what would happen if the Germans decided not to go down with this suicidal mission and rather focused on being the master of all of Europe? I want to tell you that the German ruling ideology and the Führer himself despised communism. They viewed communism as backwards and believed that if they invaded the Soviet Union, the country would collapse in a couple of months. If you want the Germans not to invade the Soviet Union, we need to somehow convince the German Führer that this is a suicide mission, which is really unlikely to happen in a realistic way. The only way for that to happen is to completely eliminate the Führer and replace him with somebody more reasonable. By the end of the video, we will see a highly successful German empire that has defeated Britain, or something that you wouldn't expect. I already told you that convincing the German High Command not to invade the Soviet Union is one of the most unrealistic things possible. This is because they didn't fear communism, believing that if the war started in the summer, they would destroy the largest country in the world, having at least twice the population of the German Reich, at least before winter even starts. The German Führer also believed that it's the destiny of the German people to spread everywhere on Earth. Ukraine and other Soviet territories were desired by Germany, as the German Führer wanted to populate these territories by Germans, increasing the living space of, to him, the superior German race. I already hinted towards getting rid of the German Führer, as to me there is no possible way for Germany not to attack the Soviet Union. We would need to assassinate the German Führer and replace him with somebody less insane, who would for now decide to invade all of Europe and capitulate Britain, rather than starting new war against a global power. I realize that getting rid of the German Führer is highly unlikely, but there is no possible way for this scenario to succeed. I'll try to be as realistic as possible and give you a realistic way that the German Führer can be assassinated and replaced. The most famous assassination attempt was codenamed Operation Valkyrie, and it came close to achieving its goal, as a bomb went off in the room but wounded an army general. The problem with this is that it happened in 1944, so 3 years after Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The July 20th plot was carried out against the German Führer, as the German army generals wanted to get rid of him, as a result of the losses in the Battle of Stalingrad and the Soviet army still resisting. While this happened 3 years after Operation Barbarossa, we can use this as a blueprint to create another plot to assassinate the Führer. The problem is that all was going good for Germany until they invaded the Soviet Union. They had conquered all France and then the Balkans, so the Germans were pretty much the masters of Europe. Since all was going good for Germany, the army generals had no reason to get rid of the Austrian painter. As a result, I would need to force a disastrous event that wouldn't change the course of the war, but would also result in the assassination of the German Führer. Previously, I made a video regarding what if Operation Sealion succeeded. All you need to know is that Germany wouldn't have the mindset that once France capitulates, the British would also follow. As a result, the British troops on Dunkirk would be captured. In that scenario, Germany would later go on to win the Battle of Britain, achieving air superiority, and finally, Germany would manage to take the French Navy, which was destroyed by Britain historically. If all of these things go right for Germany, Operation Sealion could have been carried out with close to 200,000 German soldiers landing in Britain mostly unopposed. The fact is that the British couldn't stop the Germans from landing, and actually, landing was the easy part. Supplying these soldiers with new men and equipment was the most difficult part. Once the Germans land, then the Royal Navy knows exactly where to patrol, so they can sink enemy ships. As a result, they wouldn't have to guard all of Britain's coastline, but a small beachhead. In that video, I gave out 2 scenarios. Most importantly, there was a realistic one where the 200,000 German soldiers would get defeated and captured, sort of like reverse Dunkirk. This is because these 200,000 soldiers cannot hope to capture London, a city even at the time of 8 million people. They can try to besiege it, but these soldiers are by far not enough to keep it up for long. In a realistic Operation Sealion, the Germans cannot hope to capitulate Britain while Churchill is still Prime Minister. I mention all of this because I want to borrow the ending for that scenario. I would claim that in this alternate history, had Germany failed Operation Sealion, Operation Barbarossa most likely wouldn't have been carried out. I would have the German Führer get assassinated as a result of him directly losing 200,000 soldiers over the British Isles. This is because historically, nobody in the army even thought that a naval invasion of Britain was a good idea. Let me remind you that these are the same people who thought that invading the Soviet Union was going to be easy and only take a couple of months. So, even if they say that a naval invasion of Britain is impossible, they must mean it. The German Führer would disagree and insist on trying, and when this eventually fails, the army would be dissatisfied and would try to assassinate him right away. They would do that when they uncover the plans for attacking the Soviet Union, which the army generals would believe would be a suicidal mission. I think that at that point, the army generals would decide to get rid of the German Führer and replace him with somebody more rational like Erwin Rommel. I chose Rommel as he didn't have the political views of the ultranationalist German party, which is important so the people closely affiliated with the Austrian painter didn't fear the Soviet Union. They saw the Slavic people as inferior to them and thought that it was their destiny to settle in Eastern Europe. Funnily though, in 2024 it is the destiny of Eastern Europe to settle into Germany. Oh, how the tables have turned. Jokes aside, while Erwin Rommel is not the most realistic candidate, the other alternatives are individuals like Heinrich Himmler and Martin Bormann, who I still think would want to invade the Soviet Union. Let me remind you that getting rid of the Austrian painter doesn't automatically get rid of the German ultranationalist party and ideology. There is going to be a huge split between the army and the ultranationalist party, so members of each would start assassinating each other. The Gestapo would try to prevent the army from taking over, but they would fail. This is because after the disastrous defeat in Britain, the people wouldn't be as optimistic to send millions of men into Russia, as most fear they wouldn't return. Even if I'm wrong here, I don't see any possible way for Operation Barbarossa not to take place, so I have to somehow fit the video's narrative. I say that the army would take over Germany, but there can be a brief civil war which the army would of course win. This is because they would have all of the soldiers. The ultranationalist party has the SS and some loyalists, but they cannot beat the entirety of the German army. As a result, the Second World War would have another phony period where both sides would just sit around and do nothing. After about 6 months of doing nothing, Japan would strike Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States into the conflict. Now, Erwin Rommel and the rest of the army is unlikely to declare war on the United States of America, and the US won't declare war on Germany right away. Eventually, the two sides would be at war due to common allies and enemies. For example, Britain would be fighting Germany and Japan, and the US would be collaborating with Britain regarding the defeat of Japan, but also later the German Reich. I want to tell you that around the same time the German nuclear program was completely abandoned. We all know that it was seen as Jewish science by the ultranationalist Germans. But even if the army takes over, the Germans are still so far behind that there is practically no catching up to the Americans. The army is likely to realize that they soon would be at war with the United States of America, which had a huge economy and navy. The writing for them was on the wall, that unless they sign a peace treaty soon, the Americans would be after them. This is a big problem, as the Germans this time will not invade the Soviet Union and take Ukraine. This is important as food shortages would soon become a problem in the German Reich, as the German allies cannot feed all of Germany's population, which would unfortunately lead to more people dying of starvation. I read somewhere in France that the average Frenchman was receiving 25% of his required daily calories, so it can become even worse. At this point, the most logical decision for the army is to sign a peace treaty, slightly alter the borders in Europe, but end this devastating conflict. If the timing is right, it would happen at the peak of Japan's military competence. This would allow for the Allies to focus on Japan entirely, as the Japanese quickly seized the Philippines and British Malaya. In Europe, France would just lose Alsace-Lorraine to Germany, and Nice, Savoy, Corsica and Tunisia to Italy. Britain would give up Gibraltar to Spain, Malta to Italy, and the Italians would unite the Horn of Africa. The Germans would also keep their gains in the Balkans, which the Allies would recognize. This is a mild peace treaty that I would say is very reasonable. The army doesn't have such ambitions to conquer the world like the German ultranationalist party. Even if you shout at me that this peace treaty is unrealistic, as Britain didn't want to surrender, it doesn't change the outcome of the scenario. Whether Germany signs a peace treaty with the Allies or not, it doesn't really matter. This is because I'm yet to cover the Soviet Union, who was a natural enemy of the German Reich. Many claim that if Germany didn't invade the Soviet Union, that the Soviets would have invaded Germany instead, which is a position that I also support. As a result, we can see the Soviet Union invading around mid-1942 when the Battle of Stalingrad historically happened. This is important to mention as the Battle of Stalingrad was seen as the turning point of the war against Germany and the Axis. By mid-1942, we can expect the Soviet Union to be well prepared for a war, so when they join the conflict, they wouldn't be pushed out of the entirety of Ukraine, for example. I think that the Soviets would still lose ground, maybe some key cities like Minsk, Kiev and Odessa, but that's about it. The Germans would never advance as far as they did historically, so they would stop halfway to Stalingrad. This is why I said the peace treaty between the Axis and the Allies doesn't matter. Even if peace is signed and Germany has thousands freed up troops sent into the Soviet Union, the Germans didn't lose the war because they were lacking soldiers, but lost because they were lacking supplies. More soldiers doesn't automatically result in a German victory. Even if there is a peace treaty between the Axis and the Allies, once the Soviet Union declares war on Germany and start pushing them back around 1944, the Allies would have mostly dealt with Japan. This is important because France and Britain can declare war on the Axis and seek to take their lands back, bringing the United States of America into the war. So even if there is peace in 1942 between the Axis and the Allies, it wouldn't last for long, and soon Germany would be fighting on two fronts yet again, with D-Day succeeding and Italy being conquered. The army is likely to resist in both scenarios, and just for the sake of this video, I use the scenario where the peace treaty is unsigned between the Axis and the Allies, but the phony war is resumed for a whole 2 years. In 1944, the Allies would land in Europe and the Soviet Union would be on the offense, soon nearing the German mainland. At that point, the German army is reasonable enough to sign a peace treaty and lose some territories and influence, something that the ultranationalist Germans wouldn't accept. The army, which would rule Germany in this alternate history, would for sure capitulate with the Allies, so the Allied territory would be returned. The German army and the Allies would have a lot in common, and the Allies can use a stronger Germany as a buffer against communism. Germany would still have to pay tons of war reparations to the Allies, with the Rhineland being occupied for the time being. This is why the army would be mostly kept in charge of Germany, but the ultranationalists would be purged and tried out for their crimes against the Jewish people and other deemed to their ideology as undesirable. Here the scenario really becomes anyone's guess, as Germany would keep fighting against the Soviet Union, but the Allies would still have gotten their concessions from Germany. I find it hard to predict what would happen next, as either the Allies would jointly invade the Soviet Union or let the communists walk into Germany. If the Allies invade the Soviet Union, partnering with Germany, this is a whole other scenario that I cannot cover, but I assume that the communists in Moscow would lose sooner or later. If the Allies decide not to help Germany against the Soviet Union, they might do something really interesting. Earlier I mentioned that Germany would be giving war reparations to the Allies, but in a scenario where the Soviet Union walks into mainland Germany, this can force the Allies to invade Germany instead. This is because if the communists were to be victorious in Germany, the Allies will not see their war reparations, so they would be forced to invade. As a result, Germany would be split up once again, maybe along similar lines. A similar situation is that of the Balkans and Eastern Europe, with the same countries finding themselves in the Soviet sphere of influence. This would practically result in the historical peace treaty, barring a few exceptions. At best, if the German army plays their cards right, they would keep most of their pre-war territories with the consent of the Allies. Either way, this is a very unrealistic scenario. All of this happened because we got rid of the Austrian painter, so we would have to guess for most of the stuff that happened. As a result, I don't think that anything I just mentioned would actually happen. But since I'm already unrealistic, I decided to make this scenario more interesting by spicing it up with some peace treaties, just so I can keep you on the edge. Either way, Germany didn't win the Second World War in this scenario, but how about if Yugoslavia remained in the Axis? There, Germany would most likely win the Battle of Stalingrad and capture the Caucasus oil, so does this result in an Axis victory? Check this video out to see for yourself. Thank you for watching and I hope to see you there.